If you look at an X-ray of a broken arm, it's binary.
Right, totally.
You see the jagged white line through the bone, and you know exactly what you are dealing with. It's broken or it's not. There is a comfort in that kind of precision.
Absolutely.
But when you step into the world of geopolitics, national identity, and, well, global supply chains, that X-ray machine just shatters completely. You are suddenly looking at a landscape that is incredibly murky.
Oh, murky is the perfect word for it.
Right. And, we are sitting here in mid-June of 2026. And if you look at the Isthmus of Panama today, you see a nation that embodies this glittering, almost unbelievable paradox.
It really is a study in profound, dizzying contrasts. I mean, on one hand, you fly into Panama City and you are greeted by this breathtaking skyline.
It looks like Miami or Dubai.
Exactly. You see dozens of these ultra-modern glass towers reflecting the Pacific Ocean, and they're housing a world-class logistics economy. It effectively serves as the beating heart of global trade. You see wealth.
A whole lot of wealth.
Right. Then you pan the camera just a few miles away, or you look out toward the rural edges of the country, and the reality just fractures.
Yeah.
You find crippling water scarcity. You see indigenous communities fighting these desperate battles over ancestral lands and climate displacement, and you encounter an international reputation that is, still carrying some very heavy, very visible bruises.
Yeah, and that's our mission today, to make sense of that shattered X-ray for you, the listener. We are taking this massive 18-part historical dossier, a 5-century story of this tiny, vital strip of land, and we're bringing it right up to the present second.
Which is quite the task.
It is.
Yeah.
I want to understand how Panama evolved from a colonial transit route into a fiercely sovereign nation, and why the global scramble for this specific geography is incredibly far from over.
And because our mission is to look at the present day, we really need to place a very firm date stamp on this deep dive. Like you mentioned, we are analyzing the landscape as it stands right now, mid-2026.
Things are moving incredibly fast.
They are. The geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting beneath our feet. So when we deal with highly charged topics, whether it is the massive ongoing tug-of-war between the United States and China over maritime influence, or the intensely polarized domestic policy decisions happening inside the Panamanian government right now under President Jose Raul Mulino, our goal is strictly to present the facts.
Right, just the facts and the mechanism.
Exactly. We are laying out the competing perspectives exactly as they exist in the source material. We're not endorsing or taking sides on any of them.
Totally. So let's unpack the financial engine first. Because before we can even look at the physical canal, the water and the ships, we have to understand the invisible infrastructure that makes Panama so powerful today.
That's a great place to start.
Because Panama in 2026 is not just a ditch filled with water.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a financial powerhouse. They grew by roughly 4% in 2025, even with massive global headwinds.
Yeah, and that prosperity is built on 3 very deliberate pillars. First, you have the operational framework of the canal itself.
Which changed completely in 1999.
Right. In the lead up to the handover from the U.S. in '99, there was enormous global anxiety. The world was terrified that a developing nation couldn't maintain this marvel of engineering.
There was a lot of condescension there.
Oh, massive amounts. But Panama created the Panama Canal Authority, or the ACC. Under the leadership of Alberto Alemán Zubieta, they designed an institutional framework that completely insulated the waterway from domestic political interference.
So the politicians couldn't just use it as a piggy bank.
Exactly. They set it up to run like an independent, world-class corporation, and they proved they could run it better and honestly more profitably than the Americans ever did.
Which feeds into the second pillar, the Colón Free Zone. And we hear the term free port thrown around a lot, but to really grasp the scale of Colón, you have to imagine an entirely separate commercial ecosystem sitting at the Atlantic entrance of the canal.
It's huge.
It's not just a place where ships drop off boxes. It is a massive repackaging and distribution hub. Goods arrive from Asia in bulk. They are broken down, repackaged, and then distributed throughout Latin America and the Caribbean.
And it is seamlessly paired with a transisthmus railway. You have uninterrupted cargo movement from ocean to ocean.
Right, like if a ship is too heavy, or if they just don't want to wait in line for the canal, what do?
They can offload their containers onto a train in Colón, zip them across the 50 miles of land to the Pacific port of Balboa, and load them right onto another ship. It is a logistics dream.
It really is.
And that brings us to the third pillar, which is the International Banking Center situated in Panama City. This is a dense, heavily capitalized financial hub, and its superpower. It operates in a fully dollarized economy.
Which goes way back, right?
Yeah, since 1904, the U.S. dollar has been legal tender alongside the Panamanian Balboa. When you remove currency fluctuation risk from the equation for investors, international capital just floods in.
It's an incredible macroeconomic success story.
Yeah.
But that banking density, that historical reliance on financial secrecy, it had a devastatingly dark side.
It really did.
You cannot look at the modern financial identity of Panama without talking about the year 2016, because that was the year of the Panama Papers.
Right. And we're talking about an unprecedented data leak. Over 11 million documents were siphoned from the internal servers of a single Panamanian law firm, Mossack Fonseca.
11 million. It's still hard to wrap my head around that number.
It's staggering. And the documents exposed a vast, intricate network of shell companies. Now, a shell company, for those unfamiliar, is essentially a corporate entity that exists only on paper.
Just a name in a filing cabinet somewhere.
Basically, it has no active business operations, no significant assets in the country where it's registered. It is a vehicle. And what the leak showed was how the world's wealthiest individuals, politicians, and global elites used these vehicles to hide assets, dodge taxes, and in some cases, launder illicit funds.
I remember the fallout. I mean, the name Panama became globally synonymous with corruption overnight. It was everywhere.
Yeah, the country was dragged onto international gray lists by financial watchdogs.
Which forced the government to scramble, right?
Yeah.
They had to overhaul their corporate registries and enact much tougher anti-money laundering regulations just to keep their banking sector from being totally blacklisted.
Exactly. They had to act fast to save their economy, which is what makes the 2024 update to the story so fascinating. And it is a massive twist that older narratives completely miss.
Yeah, tell us about June 2024.
Well, in June 2024, a Panamanian court finally issued its ruling on the central criminal case stemming from the Panama Papers.
Okay.
And they acquitted all 28 defendants.
Wow.
That included the firm's co-founder, Jorgen Mossack. His partner, Ramon Fonseca, had actually passed away just weeks before the verdict.
I mean, I can imagine you hearing that and being totally bewildered. The entire world read the documents. We saw the emails. We saw the corporate structures. How does a court look at a mountain of leaked data that literally changed global finance and acquit everyone involved?
To understand that, we really have to look deeply into the mechanics of Panamanian digital evidence law.
Okay, lay it out for us.
The acquittal was based entirely on evidentiary and technical grounds, specifically concerning the chain of custody. See, when you prosecute a financial crime based on digital evidence, you cannot just print out a PDF you found on the internet and present it to a judge.
Right, because anyone could have made that PDF.
Exactly. You have to prove where that file came from, who had access to it, and that it wasn't altered between the moment it was copied from the server and the moment it arrived in the courtroom.
So it's really about forensic integrity.
Yes, forensic integrity is everything here. In digital forensics, investigators usually create a cryptographically secure image of a hard drive. They generate a unique hash value. It's like a string of numbers and letters that acts as a digital fingerprint.
And if that changes?
If even one pixel of a document is changed, the hash value changes. In the Mossack Fonseca case, the judges ruled that the electronic evidence pulled from the firm's servers did not meet these strict legal standards. The prosecution could not satisfy the court that the chain of custody had been flawlessly maintained.
So it's a bit like a driver getting pulled over for going 100 miles an hour down the highway.
Right, okay, I like this.
The officer writes the ticket. Dozens of witnesses see the car flying by, but the ticket gets thrown out in traffic court because the police officer's radar gun hadn't been calibrated according to the strict technical manual.
That is the perfect analogy.
The system broke down on the technical custody of the evidence. It wasn't a philosophical debate about whether speeding is legal, or in this case, whether money laundering is bad. It was mechanical failure in the prosecution's tool.
Exactly right. The court did not issue a blanket moral exoneration. They didn't declare that no money laundering ever occurred anywhere in the world.
Right.
What happened was a complete legal collapse of the domestic criminal case because the central evidence was deemed technically inadmissible.
Imagine being an international financial regulator hearing that verdict. You have spent years building this massive global push for transparency based on these leaks.
Oh, they were probably pulling their hair out.
Right. And Panama was working overtime, passing new laws to clean up its reputation, and then the foundational criminal case of the entire scandal just evaporates on a technicality.
Yeah, it leaves this lingering, complicated cloud over the financial sector even as they try to move forward. It creates a really strange duality. Modern Panama is significantly more compliant and transparent today than it was a decade ago. But the ghost of Mossack Fonseca remains this highly complex legal legacy.
So that is the abstract wealth, the financial architecture tied up in server logs, shell companies, and banking regulations. But the physical wealth of Panama is incredibly tangible.
Oh, very tangible.
And that revolves entirely around the monumental decision the country made, also back in 2016, to physically widen its watery highway.
The 2016 Canal expansion.
Yeah.
If we delve into the engineering and the global impact, this wasn't just a domestic infrastructure project to add a new lane. It was a seismic event. It literally forced the entire global shipping industry to redesign itself.
Let's talk about the mechanics of why that was necessary, because the original canal locks, the ones built by the Americans and opened in 1914, they were a marvel, but their dimensions were fixed.
Completely fixed in concrete.
Right, and they dictated the maximum size of a ship, which became known as the Panamax standard. Those ships could carry maybe 4,000 to 5,000 standard shipping containers.
But global trade is driven by economies of scale. Shipping lines realized that if they built massive ships, they could carry way more cargo for roughly the same fuel and labor cost.
Makes sense.
The problem was these new ships were simply too wide and too long to fit into the original Panamanian locks. So Panama faced an existential choice: expand the canal or watch global trade slowly bypass them for other wider routes.
And they chose to build a completely new set of locks.
They did. They opened in 2016, allowing for the passage of what are called Neo-Panamax ships.
And the scale of these Neo-Panamax ships is almost incomprehensible. We're talking about absolute leviathans capable of carrying around 14,000 containers.
14,000.
Think of a floating skyscraper laid on its side, piled high with goods. But the real story isn't just that Panama dug a wider ditch. The real story is the ripple effect. Because Panama widened its main street, every major city up and down the United States interstate was forced to adapt.
Yeah, we call this induced infrastructure.
Induced infrastructure.
Right. Suddenly, major U.S. ports along the east and Gulf coasts were staring down the barrel of obsolescence. If a port couldn't accommodate a ship carrying 14,000 containers, the shipping lines would simply skip that port.
And go somewhere else.
Exactly.
Sure.
The economic lifeblood of cities like Savannah, Charleston, and Miami was instantly threatened.
So how do you adapt to a floating skyscraper?
Well, you dig deeper and you build higher. It triggered a multi-billion-dollar scramble. The ports had to initiate massive dredging projects.
And dredging is intense, right?
It is a brutal, expensive process. You use these massive cutter suction dredgers to physically chew up the ocean floor and remove millions of cubic yards of silt and rock. Cities had to deepen their harbor channels to about 50 feet just to keep the keels of these Neo-Panamax ships from scraping the bottom.
And digging down was only half the problem. Because the most staggering statistic from the source material is what happened in the air, specifically in New York and New Jersey with the Bayonne Bridge.
Oh, the Bayonne Bridge is a phenomenal example of the leverage Panama holds over global infrastructure.
New York and New Jersey had to spend approximately $1.7 billion.
Billion with a B.
Billion with a B. And they didn't spend it to widen a shipping channel. They spent it to physically raise the roadway of the Bayonne Bridge by 64 feet.
64 feet in the air.
Because these new Neo-Panamax ships were so incredibly tall that they literally could not fit underneath the existing bridge to reach the major container terminals. The Port Authority had to engineer a way to build a higher bridge deck above the old bridge deck.
While people were still driving on it.
Yes, while keeping the old roadway open to traffic and then dismantle the lower deck once the new one was finished.
All of that engineering, all of those billions of dollars spent by American taxpayers and port authorities were a direct, unavoidable reaction to a decision made down in Panama City.
It's wild.
When you control the global choke point, you dictate the architecture of the world's coastlines.
And because the canal dictates that global infrastructure, whoever runs the ports at either end of the canal effectively holds the keys to the kingdom. Which brings us to what is arguably the most volatile geopolitical standoff of 2026.
Yeah, this is where things get really tense.
If we look at the physical endpoints of the canal, we have the port of Balboa, on the Pacific side and the Port of Cristobal on the Atlantic side.
Right. And for 2 decades, these vital logistical nodes were operated by a company called Panama Ports Company, which is a subsidiary of the massive Hong Kong-based conglomerate CK Hutchison.
Okay, so a Hong Kong company running the ports.
Exactly. Now, in the early 2000s, this was largely viewed through the lens of globalized, frictionless business. A Chinese-backed company running ports in Latin America was just international commerce at work. No big deal.
But things changed.
They changed drastically. As tensions between the United States and China escalated into a full-blown strategic rivalry over the last decade, the lens through which Washington viewed this arrangement fundamentally shifted.
It stopped being about commerce and started being about national security.
Completely.
And the timeline here accelerates at breakneck speed. Let's look at how this escalated into the full-blown crisis we are seeing right now in mid-2026. It really hits a boiling point in early 2025.
Right, with the Trump administration.
Yeah, you have U.S. President Trump making very public, very pointed declarations.
Ubi.
He calls the Panama Canal vital to U.S. national security. He warns explicitly of Chinese control over the waterway, and he even uses rhetoric about taking it back.
Now, we need to pause here. We need to provide context for why those 3 words, taking it back, are a massive historical trigger for Panama.
Please do, because I think a lot of people miss this.
To a domestic U.S. audience, that might sound like standard political rhetoric, but to Panama, it instantly invokes the trauma of the 1903 secession. Panama's original independence from Colombia was entirely engineered by the United States, specifically to secure the rights to build the canal. The resulting Ngäbe-Buglé Treaty gave the U.S. perpetual control over the canal zone.
And the crazy part about that treaty.
The most agonizing part of that history for Panamanians is that the treaty was signed by a French engineer.
Philippe Bonneau-Varilla.
Yes. Acting on Panama's behalf. Not a single Panamanian actually signed the treaty that gave away their sovereignty.
So when a U.S. president in 2025 talks about taking it back, it hits that historical nerve so hard. It feels like the 19th century imperial playbook is being dusted off.
Exactly. And the pressure applied by Washington on CK Hutchison becomes immense. So much so that in March of 2025, CK Hutchison agrees to a massive global deal.
They decide to sell.
They agree to sell their stakes in dozens of ports worldwide, including Balboa and Cristobal, to a U.S. consortium led by the financial giant BlackRock.
You would think that solves the problem for Washington. The ports move from a Chinese-linked entity to an American-led consortium. Case closed.
But geopolitics is rarely that simple.
Never.
Beijing immediately steps in. They condemn the sale, and Chinese regulators use their domestic antitrust and regulatory mechanisms to stall the entire transaction. They essentially freeze CK Hutchison's ability to finalize the deal.
So the proxy war over the supply chain is now in full swing.
Full swing. Meanwhile, the Panamanian government, desperately trying to navigate between these 2 giants, reads the tea leaves. Later in 2025, Panama formally withdraws from China's Belt and Road Initiative,
signaling a distinct shift away from Beijing.
Yes. And then the legal hammer drops domestically inside Panama. In early 2026, Panama's own Supreme Court steps in.
What do?
They issue a ruling that voids the CK Hutchison port concessions entirely, declaring the renewal of their contract unconstitutional.
Wow, it is a stunning legal maneuver.
It really is. With the CK Hutchison concession voided, the Panamanian government steps in and awards interim control of the ports to 2 major European shipping giants.
Who did they bring in?
APM Terminals, which is part of Maersk, takes over Balboa on the Pacific, and MSC's operator steps in at Cristobal on the Atlantic.
Okay, so European operators now, does that end it?
No, because CK Hutchison refuses to just walk away. They launch international arbitration against Panama. So as of mid-2026, this is a live, fiercely contested legal and diplomatic battlefield.
And because this is so live, we really have to look at the 2 competing frameworks here impartially. How is the world interpreting this standoff? Let's start with the U.S. perspective.
Okay, so the U.S. perspective, which is echoed by defense and security analysts in Washington, views this as an absolute necessity.
A defensive move.
Right. They see it as a defensive measure to counter encroaching Chinese strategic influence over one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet. The U.S. military relies heavily on the canal for hemispheric defense.
Sure.
To them, a Hong Kong-based company running the physical infrastructure at the entrances of the canal is a glaring vulnerability that just cannot be tolerated in an era of great power competition.
But then you have the Panamanian perspective. Yes. For many Panamanians, this entire saga is deeply troubling, regardless of how they feel about China. They view this as A small, sovereign nation having its arm violently twisted by a superpower.
Yeah, that 1903 echo we talked about.
Yeah, exactly. Panama officially insists that the canal is strictly neutral and will remain Panamanian. But when they see Washington applying this kind of diplomatic and economic pressure to force the sale of port concessions, many view it as a direct threat to their sovereignty.
It highlights a profound geopolitical reality. Sovereignty on paper is very different from sovereignty in practice.
That's incredibly well put.
You can hold the deed to the property, but when two global hegemons are fighting on your front porch, your ability to make independent choices is severely constrained.
And yet, as intense as that foreign superpower fight over the ports is, the source material makes it incredibly clear that Panama is facing an internal existential threat to the canal itself.
An even bitter threat.
Yeah, an enemy that cannot be fought with treaties or arbitration or BlackRock buyouts.
Because you cannot negotiate with the climate, and you cannot run a water bridge without water.
Let's talk about the mechanics of the water, because this is the deepest threat of all, and it requires us to correct a very common misconception about how the Panama Canal actually works.
Yeah.
A lot of people picture the Suez Canal.
Right, which is just a trench.
Exactly. The Suez is essentially a sea-level trench dug through the sand in Egypt. The water from the Mediterranean Sea just flows directly into the Red Sea. It is a flat, continuous body of water.
But the Panama Canal is fundamentally different. It is an intricate, gravity-fed water bridge. It literally floats ships up and over the Continental Divide using a series of massive locks.
It's mind-blowing when you really think about it.
It is. The highest point of the canal, Gatun Lake, sits about 85 feet above sea level. When a ship enters the canal, a massive set of steel doors closes behind it, and valves are opened.
And this is where the engineering is just brilliant, but incredibly resource-intensive. There are no massive water pumps pushing this water around.
No, it all works on gravity.
Water from Gatun Lake flows down through massive underground culverts. I mean, some of them are large enough to drive a train through.
Easily.
And that water fills the lock chamber, physically lifting the 100,000-ton cargo ship.
And the lifeblood of that entire system is fresh water. It is drawn primarily from two massive artificial lakes, Gatun Lake and Alajuela, which is also known as Madden Lake.
And the math here is staggering.
It is. It takes tens of millions of gallons of fresh water to fill the lock chambers for a single transit. And when the ship finishes its journey and is lowered back down to sea level, that fresh water is flushed out into the ocean.
It mixes with the salt water.
Exactly. It is gone forever.
Every single ship, millions of gallons of fresh water drawn from the lakes used to float the ship and then just dumped into the ocean.
Now, that system works perfectly fine in a tropical rainforest that receives immense amounts of rainfall until the rain stops.
Which brings us to the severe crisis of 2023 and 2024.
Right. Panama was hit by an exceptionally strong El Niño weather pattern, which triggered a historic prolonged drought. The water levels in Gatun and Alajuela lakes dropped so precipitously that the Panama Canal Authority was forced into emergency measures.
They essentially had to ration the ocean.
They literally slashed the number of daily transits allowed through the canal. And more critically, they imposed severe draft limits.
Remind us what the draft is.
The draft of a ship is the distance between the waterline and the lowest point of the hull. If a ship is heavily loaded with cargo, it sits lower in the water, meaning it has a deeper draft.
Got it.
Because the lake levels were so low, the Canal Authority had to mandate that ships ride higher in the water to avoid scraping the bottom. This meant shipping lines had to physically unload thousands of containers before arriving or send partially empty ships through the canal.
And the ripple effect on global supply chains was massive.
Huge.
We saw incredible bottlenecks, particularly for ships carrying liquefied natural gas, or LNG, which rely heavily on the canal to get from the U.S. Gulf Coast to markets in Asia.
Now, the source dossier notes that this specific crisis did ease up. By August of 2024, the rains had returned sufficiently to bring the canal back to full capacity.
Good news, right?
Yes, but the ACP is not resting on its laurels. They recognize that climate volatility is the new normal. They are already engineering for the next expected El Niño, which climate models suggest could hit around 2027.
So how do you engineer your way out of a drought when your entire business model requires flushing fresh water into the sea?
You build a bigger bathtub.
A bigger bathtub.
Yeah. The government is currently advancing a massive new infrastructure project, the $1.6 billion Rio Indio Dam. The goal is to construct this by roughly 2032.
Okay, and what does that do?
By damming the Rio Indio, they intend to create a new, vast reservoir system that can be piped into Gatun Lake, creating a larger buffer of fresh water to survive these dry years.
But this is where the story shifts away from engineering and touches on pure human survival.
It really does.
Because there is a critical, agonizing friction to this entire water system. Those exact same lakes, Gatun, Alajuela, they don't just supply the locks.
No, they don't. They provide the municipal drinking water for roughly half of Panama's entire population.
Half the country. It is a zero-sum game between global logistics and basic human necessity. Every single gallon of rain that falls on that watershed is fiercely contested.
It is.
Imagine if your city's local drinking reservoir was also the only highway for international commerce. Every time a cargo ship passes through to deliver cheap electronics or LNG to the rest of the world, millions of gallons of your potential drinking water get flushed into the ocean.
The Canal Authority is literally weighing the passage of a container ship against the water pressure in the pipes of Panama City. It is an agonizing position for a government to be in, balancing the economic lifeblood of the nation against the literal lifeblood of its citizens.
And what's really striking is that this environmental pressure, the drought, the shifting climate, the fight over resources, it doesn't just affect the people living in the high-rises of the capital.
Not at all.
In fact, the source material shows that the heaviest burden of modern Panama falls on the people living on the extreme edges of the country's economic boom.
Yes. The prosperity we analyzed earlier, the banking center, the free zone, is highly uneven. The front lines of climate change, of deforestation, and of resource extraction are inhabited by Panama's indigenous nations.
Who are we talking about specifically?
Primarily, we are talking about the Guna, the Emberá and the Ngäbe-Buglé peoples.
And these groups have a unique political structure, right?
They do. They govern semi-autonomous territories known as comarcas. It gives them a degree of self-governance over their ancestral lands. But, as we see, autonomy on paper doesn't stop the physical environment from collapsing around you.
Let's look at the Guna people specifically, because there is a story from 2024 that serves as a devastating warning siren for the rest of the world.
You are referring to Gardi Sugdub.
Yes.
This was a vibrant, densely populated Guna community living on a small island in the Gunayala archipelago off the Caribbean coast of Panama. For generations, their entire culture and livelihood were tied to living directly on the water. But due to rising sea levels driven by global climate change, the island literally began to sink beneath them.
Sinking.
Yeah. The flooding went from being an occasional nuisance during storms to a relentless daily reality. The ocean was reclaiming the land.
And in 2024, the situation became physically untenable.
Completely. The entire community of Gardi Sugdub had to be relocated to a newly built settlement on the mainland.
We are talking about physically moving an entire society.
They became one of the very first communities in the Western Hemisphere to be completely displaced and relocated strictly because of rising sea levels.
It is a profound cultural trauma, tearing people away from the sea that define them.
And it is a stark preview of the climate migration that is coming to coastal communities globally.
So you have climate displacement hitting the Caribbean edge. But there are two other massive pressures squeezing the edges of Panama right now. One is a crisis of human movement, and the other is a crisis of geological extraction.
Let's start with the human movement, the Darien Gap.
The Darien Gap. That is that dense, notoriously dangerous stretch of roadless jungle connecting Colombia and Panama. It is the only break in the Pan-American Highway.
Right. And for years, it has been a perilous transit point for migrants trying to make their way north to the United States. But in 2023, the numbers absolutely exploded.
How many people are we talking about?
We saw a record of roughly 500,000 people crossing that jungle in a single year.
500,000 through a jungle with no roads.
Yes. And the humanitarian crisis was staggering. We are talking about people traversing mountainous terrain, dense rainforests, facing flash floods, venomous wildlife, and heavily armed cartels that control the smuggling routes.
The death toll and the human suffering were immense.
Immense, but the numbers dropped significantly after that peak.
Which raises the question, how does a government actually stop movement through an unpoliceable jungle?
Through aggressive state intervention and geopolitical alignment. In July 2024, the new president of Panama, José Raúl Mulino, took office. And almost immediately, he signed a major migration and deportation deal with the United States.
So the U.S. gets involved directly.
The U.S. provided funding and logistical support, and Panama began physically cracking down. They funneled migrants into specific choke points, increased heavily subsidized deportation flights, and heavily restricted movement through the Darien.
And it worked.
By 2024 and into 2025, we saw a steep drop in those crossing numbers. The flow was heavily throttled by physical border enforcement and immediate deportations.
So that is the migration pressure. But the other massive flashpoint right now, and this might be the most volatile domestic issue in Panama as of mid-2026, is the Cobre Panamá copper mine.
The Cobre Panamá mine. This is operated by the Canadian firm First Quantum, and we need to be clear about the scale here.
Yeah, paint a picture for us.
This is not a small, localized operation. It is a massive, open-pit copper mine situated in a highly sensitive ecological zone. At its peak, this single mine represented approximately 5% of Panama's entire national GDP.
5% from one mine.
It was a massive engine of employment and foreign direct investment. But the environmental cost was staggering, and the public backlash was visceral.
Why were people angry?
Well, environmentalists, indigenous groups, and wide swaths of the Panamanian public argue that the open-pit mining process was devastating the local ecosystem. It was causing severe deforestation and threatening the vital watersheds that feed both the communities and, potentially, the canal system itself.
In late 2023, this anger boiled over into the largest nationwide protests Panama had seen in a generation.
The country was practically paralyzed.
Major highways were blockaded, ports were disrupted, and the public demanded the immediate closure of the mine. It shows the incredible power of Panamanian protest culture.
It really does.
When we look back at the history, this level of public mobilization has deep roots. In 1964, during the Martyrs' Day protests, Panamanian students literally laid down their lives, facing gunfire from U.S. forces just for the right to fly the Panamanian flag in the American-controlled Canal Zone.
A huge turning point.
Even further back, the Watermelon Riot of 1856, where a dispute over a slice of fruit escalated into a massive, violent uprising against American transit workers. There is a deep historical willingness in Panama to take to the streets to defend sovereignty and land.
And the 2023 protests achieved their goal. The Supreme Court stepped in, reviewed the government's contract with First Quantum, and ruled it unconstitutional. The mine was effectively shut down.
Which brings us to the incredibly tense political reality of today, mid-2026.
Yes, because President Mulino is looking at the national balance sheet. He sees a 5% hole in his GDP.
That's a big hole.
It's massive. He has international business leaders pushing him constantly, arguing that restarting the mine is absolutely essential for economic growth, especially if the country needs to fund massive infrastructure projects like the Rio Indio Dam.
So Mulino is actively pushing the political and legal mechanisms to restart operations at Cobre Panamá.
He is.
And the public reaction to Mulino's push.
Ferocious. We are seeing renewed, intense protests. And it's not just about the copper mine anymore. The protests have amalgamated into a broader systemic movement against Mulino's entire agenda.
They're protesting everything.
Right. They are protesting the potential mine restart because of the environmental threat. They are protesting the new U.S. security agreements regarding migration, seeing it as bowing to Washington's demands, and they are fiercely protesting a very controversial piece of pension reform legislation known as Law 462. The streets are incredibly active.
It is the ultimate paradox of Panamanian development. If that copper mine represents 5% of the national GDP, and the administration insists they need that revenue to keep the economy afloat, how does a government possibly balance that immediate economic incentive against the long-term risk of destroying the watersheds?
It's the impossible question.
If you poison the water to extract the copper, you lose the canal, you lose the drinking water, and the entire economic engine seizes up anyway.
It is the defining friction between extracting short-term value from the land and preserving the land's fundamental long-term utility.
Right.
And as we connect this modern struggle over land, water, and wealth to the broader historical picture we've been analyzing, what we realize is that this isn't a new fight.
No.
The fight over who controls the resources and the geography of the isthmus is a 500-year-old story.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this entire 18-part journey. We've spent hours in this dossier tracing the evolution of this land from a colonial route to a sovereign nation. And when you look at the whole arc, the conclusion is inescapable.
Geography is destiny.
Because it is the narrowest strip of land on Earth separating two massive oceans, the Isthmus of Panama has always served three functions simultaneously.
What are they?
It has been a bridge for commerce, it has been a wall keeping oceans apart, and it has been a prize.
Let's look at the historical attempts to conquer that geography. We saw the Spanish conquest, the brutal establishment of the Camino Real, where inconceivable amounts of ink and silver were hauled by enslaved people across the jungle trails to fund the Spanish Empire.
And we saw the catastrophic failure of the Scottish Darien scheme in the late 1690s.
Oh, that was a disaster.
The Company of Scotland tried to establish a colony called New Caledonia in the Darien Gap, hoping to control an overland trade route. They were decimated by malaria, yellow fever, and Spanish blockades.
The failure was so absolute that it bankrupted the entire nation of Scotland, forcing them into the Acts of Union with England.
The geography broke them, just as it broke the French attempt in the 1880s.
Ferdinand de Lesseps.
Right. Fresh from his triumph at the Suez Canal, he believed he could dig a sea-level trench through the Panamanian mountains. It was an act of supreme hubris. The jungle, the mudslides, and the mosquito-borne diseases killed over 20,000 workers and bankrupted the French effort.
Then the Americans arrived, engineered the 1903 secession from Colombia, and brought a different kind of control. We saw the magnificent engineering of the Lock Canal, made possible only because Dr. William Gorgas figured out how to eradicate the mosquito.
But we also saw the horrific social reality of the American Canal era.
The systemic segregation.
Yes, the gold and silver rolls. The U.S. administration instituted a codified apartheid system during the canal's construction and operation. White American workers were paid in gold, and they received better housing, schools, and privileges.
And everyone else.
The vast workforce of West Indian and black laborers were paid in local silver currency, relegated to squalid living conditions, and treated as completely expendable labor. The canal was built on their backs.
And the canal zone itself became a heavily fortified U.S. military outpost, effectively cutting a sovereign country entirely in half for nearly a century.
But the true arc of this 500-year history isn't about the empires that tried to conquer it. The empires, the Spanish, the British, the French, the Americans, they come and go. The true story is about the Panamanian people. The indigenous communities like the Guna, who predate the arrival of the cross, the descendants of enslaved Africans, the West Indian laborers, the mestizo populations.
They're the ones who paid the ultimate price.
They built the infrastructure with their sweat and their blood. They lived through the gold and silver rolls. They lived through the 1989 U.S. invasion that ousted Manuel Noriega. And against all odds, they finally reclaimed their geography as their own on December 31st, 1999.
They proved they could govern the Crossroads. But as we look at the reality of 2026, it brings us back to the central, enduring question that this series has circled since the very first page.
What's that?
What does it truly cost a small country to own the crossroads of the world, and what does it take to keep it? What we see today is that sovereignty is not a trophy you win once and put on a shelf. It is an ongoing, daily, exhausting negotiation.
You are constantly negotiating against the climate and the drought. You are negotiating against the gravitational pull of global powers who view your ports as strategic assets in their own proxy wars. And you are negotiating against deep internal divisions over mining, water, and national identity.
The negotiation is never finished. It requires an incredible balancing act of diplomacy, engineering, and domestic policy just to survive the sheer weight of your own geography.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final forward-looking thought, something to mull over that builds on everything we've discussed today, but looks to where the world is heading next.
I'm intrigued.
For 500 years, empires fought over Panama to control the flow of physical goods. They fought over the Spanish silver, the California gold during the 1849 rush, and now the massive Neo-Panamax cargo containers. It was all about moving physical weight across physical water.
But as we look past 2026, the global economy is fundamentally changing.
Exactly. The world is becoming entirely dependent on the flow of data. The digital rivers of information that connect the hemispheres, the fiber optic cables that carry the world's internet, international banking and communications, they route right through the Isthmus of Panama.
Because it is the narrowest point between the oceans, it is the most efficient place to lay these cables.
Right. Those physical data lines are becoming just as vital to global survival as the shipping lanes. So I leave you with this. As the world shifts from moving rivers of water to moving rivers of information, will Panama find itself fighting the exact same 500-year war for its sovereignty, just on a newly invisible battlefield?
That is a fascinating question, When great powers want to control the data, who will they pressure to control the cables?
The crossroads, it seems, is never fully conquered. Thank you so much for joining us on this expansive deep dive into the history and the modern reality of Panama. We invite you to keep exploring, keep analyzing the narratives you hear, and keep questioning the complex world around you.